Hello, I'm Namo Abdullah here in front of the MIT to do an interview with Professor Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky is a linguist, political activist, philosopher. I'm here to do an interview with him on the long-standing Kurdish issue in the Middle East. The Kurds estimate that some 30 to 40 million people are living in adjacent parts of Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Iraq. Now let's see what Noam Chomsky's thoughts are on this issue in the Middle East. We are really pleased to have you with us, Professor Chomsky.
Thank you.
And I would like to start with the question of how you became interested in the Kurdish issue in the first place.
Oh, quite a long time ago. I mean, I don't have to tell you that the travail of the Kurds has been very bitter and brutal. I can't remember when I learned about it. It must be 50 years ago. But then in the 70s, I followed it pretty closely with what went on with the interactions between the Shah and Henry Kissinger and so on, all those ugly things, and then of course in the 1980s. But then later I became more focused on the Kurds in Turkey, and I've visited there a few times, been in Diyarbakir, was involved with protests against the repression, which in the 90s was pretty horrible, and improved a little in the years since, but it's now unfortunately regressing.
Yeah, as you said, things have sort of improved, and as we are seeing now change sweeping the Arab world, and it has reached Syria, where a significant portion of the Greater Kurdistan territory is located. What kind of impact do you see these Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring, might have on the Kurdish question?
Well, the outcome of the Arab Spring is pretty indefinite at the moment. It's different in different countries. In the oil dictatorships, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Kuwait, it's had almost no impact. I mean, in Saudi Arabia, the first efforts to participate, even symbolically, in the Friday demonstrations were crushed instantly. In Bahrain, you know what happened, and so that region, the oil-producing region, it's essentially nothing much has yet happened, thanks to due to repression. In northern Africa, that's where the main progress has been. In Tunisia, there has been significant moves towards a more open democratic society. Of course, they got rid of the dictator. Egypt is a kind of a mixed story. That's the most important country, given its size and role in the Arab world. But and there were real achievements. I mean, the dictator was gone. There's been significant progress in the freedom of speech. A crucial achievement was in right of labor organization. Both in Tunisia and Egypt, there had been militant labor organizations, mostly crushed by the dictatorship, but with some gains. And this freed them up. In fact, their participation in the uprisings, I think, probably what essentially made the difference. And that's been improved. There's now an independent labor organizing, moves towards an independent union for the first time, a unified one. On the other hand, the regime is still in place.
What I'm interested in are the impacts of these Arab Spring revolutions on the Kurds. Do you think there might be some possibilities for the Kurds to gain some sort of independence in any of the regions where they live?
I wish I could say yes, but I don't really see much of an impact. I think the question is whether the Arab Spring uprisings will be contained. If they'll be contained, I don't think there'll be much of an impact. If they grow and develop and spread beyond, then there could be an impact. But for the moment, they've been pretty much contained. I mean, there has been progress in Tunisia and Egypt. Syria's a monstrosity, but the impact of the Arab Spring has so far been, it's been significant, and it's of historic importance, but it's still been constrained within the places where significant action has been taking place, primarily Egypt and Tunisia. What you'd hope would happen was that it would lead to pressures for more independence and freedom in other regions. But that has not much happened. I mean, in Turkey, it's going backwards. Iraqi Kurdistan retains its relative autonomy. In Syria, I suppose the Kurdish population is probably fleeing if they can.
But if we take Iraqi Kurdistan, for example, the Kurds already enjoy a semi-autonomous status, and the Kurdish leadership and the people are already speaking in louder voices of the possibilities of establishing a state.
But do you think that's an impact of the Arab Spring?
I mean, one could say they have been emboldened by
the Arab Spring. Well, if so, that's a good thing. But my whatever limited knowledge I have of it, it seems to me that's mostly related to developments inside Iraq.
So are the Kurds in northern Iraq ready to declare independence, do you think?
Well, I don't have to tell you what the problems are. You know very well. If there was an independent Kurdistan in northern Iraq, it would be it's landlocked. It would be surrounded by hostile neighbors. Turkey obviously isn't going to like it. Iran's not going to like it. Arab Iraq isn't going to like it. Has very little access to the outside world, so it would be in a difficult situation, I think.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that Kurds wanted to see in northern Iraq before the withdrawal of U.S. forces was the establishment of a U.S. military base. Some Americans wanted that as well, but that did not happen. And the Kurds, I mean, can we say the Kurds are more vulnerable as a result of the withdrawal of U.S. forces in northern Iraq? Because there's...
It really depends what happens in Iraq. It depends on whether Iraq can hold together. I mean, I don't have to tell you Iraq is a total wreck after the invasion and occupation. And if it crumbles, as it might, if a major Sunni-Shia conflict erupts and the south, say the Basra area, moves towards some kind of independence, Anbar province moves towards some kind of independence, the country will pretty much split apart. What effect it might increase the opportunities for an Iraqi Kurdistan. But it is literal independence, well, has its, you can see its positive aspects from the point of view of the Kurds themselves, would carry serious problems of isolation, encirclement, hostile enemies, and so on. It's a delicate situation. I don't know. I mean, I think optimally, an Iraqi Kurdistan could become, under the best conditions, a center for a broader Kurdistan that would extend to southeastern Turkey, northern Iran. If the situation improves there, we have to see what happens in Syria. Of course, there's also Russia.
But one could say, I mean, of course, there are so many people like you saying that Turkey would oppose an independent move by the Iraqi Kurds because that would make the Kurds in Turkey ask the same demands, right? But one could say that Turkish interest in Iraq is sort of undermined by the rise of Iran's influence in the south of Iraq and in Baghdad. And the Shias are ruling there, and the Shias are more loyal to Iran.
They are, but Turkey has a sort of an ambivalent relationship to the Shia world. So, for example, it has pretty good relations with Iran. In fact, Turkey has not accepted except in words it does, but in practice, it hasn't accepted the U.S.-European sanctions on Iran. It's moving to its increased commercial relations. Iran and Turkey are very natural trading partners. I mean, Iran has energy, Turkey needs it. Turkey has manufacturing, Iran needs it. And so far, at least, they have not. There's problems, there's tensions, but as far as I can see, they're still moving slowly towards some kind of accommodation. And if Turkey accommodates to Iran, it'll do the same with Shiite regions in Iraq. So I don't see that that's necessarily a reason for hope for the Kurds. I think the point you made before is the crucial one. Turkey's very concerned that independence in Iraq, in northern Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan would encourage similar tendencies within southeastern Turkey. That's the real problem, where, of course, the bulk of the Kurdish population is.
But what one could say by all of these social media, with the help of social media and all of those developments, and the people have been empowered, and even if the Kurds in Turkey or the people want to have some sort of independence, I mean, what can the governments do in today's world, right?
Just what they're doing all over the place. In Saudi Arabia, they just crushed it. In Egypt, it's been constrained. You know, the previous regime is still pretty much in power. The dictatorship had a kind of a informal relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood. Technically they repressed it, but they also were somewhat integrated with it. The Muslim Brotherhood has socioeconomic policies that are that conform to the goals of the Western powers, the United States, and it could very well, I mean, they're likely takeover of the political system, at least in the short run, would be acceptable, I think, to the United States and its allies, and would sustain the neoliberal program that, in fact, was a lot of the object of the uprising. It led, as always, to pretty harsh conditions for the large majority. Technically, there was economic growth, but very narrowly concentrated, stagnation or worse for the majority, reduction of benefits, incredible corruption. Those are the usual consequences of the neoliberal programs, even to the extent that they're applied in the West. It's sort of similar. And that's probably going to remain in place. And if that's true, the U.S. will, and its allies will support it and use it to contain what they regard as radical elements. I mean, the Western powers face a real problem in the Arab world. They cannot permit democracy. They've got to do everything they can to repress authentic democratic uprisings. And there's a very simple reason for that. In fact, you can find the reason just by looking at the polls of opinion. There are regular opinion polls throughout the Arab world, done by Western polling agencies, U.S. ones, a recent one by the Center for Arab Research in Qatar, and they all come out about the same way. The population in the Arab world, as distinct from the dictators, regards the main threat they face as the United States and Israel. They don't regard Iran as a threat. They don't like Iran, but they don't regard it as a threat. And in fact, a considerable majority even think the region would be more secure if Iran had nuclear weapons. Well, the United States certainly doesn't want attitudes like that exemplified in government policies, but that's what democracy means.
I'd like to move back to Iraqi Kurdistan. In the period after the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, there have been significant oil reserves discovered by the Iraqi Kurds, and they have signed dozens of oil contracts with giant international companies, including ExxonMobil and of the United States and Total of France. Does the presence of these companies in Kurdistan boost the position of the Iraqi Kurds to secede from Iraq? And what kind of role does oil play?
Oil has a complicated role. Countries that are there's a phenomenon known in the international relations literature as the resource curse. When a country depends on export of a primary commodity, like, say, oil, there's some quite standard tendencies that follow. One is high concentration of wealth. Another is undermining of production and development in other domains. Currency rises, it's hard to export, easier to import, so it sort of crushes independent development. You see this all over, and it's probable that that would happen in the concentration of wealth, corruption, undermining of independent production and development. I suspect that the same tendencies would develop in an independent Iraqi Kurdistan, and in addition it would have the problem that it is surrounded pretty much by hostile neighbors.
Mm-hmm. But like the presence of these giant companies means that these companies have big interests in Iraqi Kurdistan. But a country like Turkey would not simply attack Kurdistan when there are huge companies investing there.
Well, that's not so clear. If Turkey wanted to attack it, the huge companies wouldn't do anything about it. Mm-hmm. They would accommodate to it.
Do you have historical examples like where huge companies' interests have boosted the position of
no, the huge oil companies are, they're very powerful, but they're really not independent agents. Mm-hmm. So take U.S. relations with Iran. It's a striking case. The major U.S. Energy corporations like ExxonMobil, they would be delighted to be able to enter Iran and exploit its huge energy resources, but they're barred by state power, which means that they have to sit there and watch while China, others get the advantage. And that's happened before. So, for example, in 1953, when the U.S. and Britain overthrew the parliamentary government in Iran, the United States wanted to displace England. There was a general process over those years of the United States displacing England, throughout the former British Empire, included Iran. So Washington wanted the American oil companies to take 40% of the Iranian concession. They didn't want to. And the reason they didn't want to is that they could get they had much more profitable operations in Saudi Arabia. And if they were to move into Iran, as Washington wanted them to, it would probably cost them. So they objected, and the U.S. government simply forced them to. It threatened antitrust suits, other measures that the government can apply, so the companies went along. It happens other places in the world, too. Take, say, Cuba. American energy corporations, pharmaceutical corporations, agribusiness, want to normalize relations with Cuba, as does the majority of the American population. Government won't permit it. So it's certainly true that the energy corporations are very significant and powerful, but not all powerful. Yeah. They are compelled to accommodate the state power. Even if, when you look closely, it may be oil company executives in the White House and State Department who are ordering them to do these things. The concerns of an individual as the CEO of a corporation can be quite different from the concerns of that same individual in a high position in the State Department or the National Security Council.
Moving from these oil-rich regions to Turkey, where there is pretty much no oil for the country's economy to depend on, I mean, this has allowed Turkey to definitely progress economically, but politically there has been so many ups and downs vis-a-vis the Kurdish question in Turkey. Even after the coming to power of Recep Tayyip Erdogan's AK party, and it's an Islamist-leaning political party which has been ruling for almost more than a decade. I mean, the Kurds, Erdogan promised to solve the Kurdish question, but the Kurds are not seeing much development.
It's the contrary. I mean, what happened in the last 10 years, by the end of the 90s, it was monstrous. But the first time I went to Diyarbakir was, I think, about 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And the people were living in caves. I mean, Turkish security officers all over the place. If my guides, who were Turkish dissidents and Human Rights Watch people, if they noticed children playing in the streets of Diyarbakir, Kurdish children, who had their clothes, the combination of colors of their clothes were the Kurdish colors, they'd steer us in a different direction because of the consequences that would follow for the parents once we left. And it was pretty ugly. This was the end of the horrible period of repression. Tens of thousands of people killed, thousands of villages destroyed, and millions of refugees, and so on. The following years it improved, and didn't become marvelous, but in the early years of this millennium it was improving. There was more latitude for the use of Kurdish, more openness for Kurdish customs and practices, and the repression clearly reduced. But in the last year or two, it's been going backwards. Now there's thousands of Kurdish activists in jail, pretty harsh repression of journalists and academics, but also of the general population. And we don't really know where that's going. The trajectory right now is not good. Actually, I was there just a couple of months ago for a freedom of speech conference in Istanbul, and one of the main issues was the renewed repression of the Kurdish population.
As a result of this continued repression by the Turkish state, we have the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party. It's an armed guerrilla movement in the mountains of northern Iraq. And it's been in a bloody struggle with Turkey for over 4 decades. And its leader is jailed in Turkey, as you know, Abdullah Öcalan. Now, when people talk of the resolution of the Kurdish question in Turkey, some people say it's impossible to resolve this issue without the participation of the PKK or Öcalan. How do you view this? Can we solve the Kurdish issue if we don't bring in these guerrillas into the discussions?
The concept of bringing in the guerrillas is kind of ambiguous. The Kurdish political parties, to a certain extent, are a cover for the PKK and kind of function in that way. It happens repeatedly. Say El Salvador, there was a guerrilla organization, FMLN, which the U.S. Fought bitterly against. I mean, El Salvador was a monstrosity in the 1980s with the U.S.-backed war against the guerrillas. They are now they now have political power. There are ways of changing these things. Things developing, so that take say Israel. Israel was the Israeli government. You go back to the 1940s. Was based on significantly on major terrorist groups. By 1980, after the State of Israel was established, literally the 3 top positions in the Israeli government, that's the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, and the head of the Jewish Agency, which is a non-governmental Zionist organization, all 3 of them were former terrorists. One of them had been jailed by the British. The others would have been if they'd been caught. But that was the government. So lots of things can happen as a guerrilla movement in the right circumstances makes a transition to being a political organization. It's happened in Guatemala. It's happened could happen in Colombia. It hasn't yet, and in many other places. Take the president of Brazil right now. She was jailed under the dictatorship and charged with terrorism, meaning opposing the dictatorship.
If you go back to Iraq, as we're running out of time, under decades of Sunni-led governments in Iraq, a genocide was carried out against the Kurds. Chemical weapons were used. Thousands of villages were razed to the ground, including my village. But since 2003, the Sunnis have been marginalized. The Shias have come to power. Should the Kurds fear that a Shia-led government might be as bad as a Sunni-led government?
The Kurds should always remember their famous slogan that the Kurds have no friends except the mountains. sure they should fear it. And in fact, if you look at, the role of the United States, which is overwhelming anywhere in the world, and certainly here. In the 1980s, as the Reagan administration supported Saddam Hussein strongly. In fact, he was taken off the terrorist list in 1982 so that the U.S. could provide him with arms. When the Al-Anfal massacre and Halabja chemical warfare took place, the U.S. government officially denied it, blamed it on Iran, would not permit Congress even to make more than symbolic objections. In 1989, and the U.S. pretty much won the war for Iraq-Iran war for Saddam. By 1989, after the war was over, and this is now George Bush #1 as president, he actually invited Iraqi nuclear engineers to come to the United States for advanced training in nuclear weapons development. Now, nobody talks about that now, because a couple of months later, they changed their policy. But the governments don't have, they're not moral agents. They pursue their interests. They can switch 180 degrees. It's happened over and over. And the U.S. invasion, U.S.-British invasion of Iraq was pretty much a failure. They didn't achieve their goals. And there was a significant defeat in the sense that the real winner of the invasion was Iran. It extended its influence into Shiite Iraq. What will happen next and how the outside powers will react depends on their calculation of interests. The record shows very clearly how easily this can change. Take what happened in Iraq in the 1970s with the repression of the Kurds. The U.S. supported uprisings. When Iraq made a deal with the Shah, the U.S. stood by quietly when the Kurds were massacred. That's when Henry Kissinger made his famous statement that you shouldn't confuse foreign policy with missionary work. In other words, we'll do what we want for our own interest.
But it seems now the Western powers have turned to become supporters of the Kurds.
For the moment, in some places. Like, for example, in Iraqi Kurdistan, the Western powers have been supporters of the Kurds. In Turkish Kurdistan, during the 90s, the period of by far the worst repression, Clinton was sending, the United States was sending 80% of the arms. And Germany, others were providing arms to the government. In fact, if you take a look closely, as the atrocities against the Kurds increased in the 90s, the U.S. arm flow increased to the extent that Turkey became the leading recipient of U.S. arms anywhere in the world, apart from Israel and Egypt, which are kind of a separate category. In fact, in 1 year, 1997, Clinton sent more arms to Turkey than in the entire Cold War period combined up to the onset of the counterinsurgency. At the same time, they were supporting Iraqi Kurds. You just can't look at, you can't look at history and believe that governments act out of kind of moral commitments. And the Kurds have a history which demonstrates this with horrible reality.
Professor Chomsky, thank you so much for this opportunity. We really appreciate your time, and your thoughts are really valuable for us.
Thank you.
It's really a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.